This talk today is about relationship. But instead of talking in my usual words, let us read some passages from a book. It's actually a screenplay called My Dinner with Andre. Ever since this movie has come out, people have urged me to see it, and I've never gotten around to seeing it. So somebody gave me this book, My Dinner with Andre by Wallace Shawn and Andre Gregory. And then somebody taped the movie for me, so finally I saw it. A couple weeks ago. And last evening, in thinking about this whole thing of relationship, this book came to mind, and I just made notes where to read certain passages that are gleaned from this book. In listening to this, particularly if you've seen the movie, can one, instead of just visualizing the whole scene that was there, which is inevitable, but since the scene was always the same, maybe it's not so hard to drop that, and just listen to these words as though one was not just talking oneself, but looking inwardly to see one's own life, to look at one's own life. Because only then will words have any meaning at all. Since passages are picked from all over and sentences or words or paragraphs left out, it is a bit jumpy, but the issue is here is not the continuity of the screenplay. Let me begin, though, with something somebody said in a meeting at the last retreat. This person came in and for the longest time didn't say anything at all. And then, as I remember the words, probably inadequately, but the essence of what was said is there. And something added. This is what was said. When I'm not there, then the other isn't there either. When I'm there, then I see the other in terms of my own wants and needs. Let me say this again. When I'm not there, meaning no feeling of self, no self-image, nothing. When I'm not there, then the other is also not there. Then there's also no image of the other. Nothing there. But when I'm there, this person said, then I see the other in terms of my own needs and wants. If I remember correctly, what was said is, these needs and wants create this other person in terms of my needs and wants. My own wants and desires make the other person into somebody or something. I see the other person in terms of what I want of him, or in terms of what I want of her or need of her, or what I don't want of him or her. I never see the other person for what he or she really is this moment. one's own wants constantly interfere. One has lived with one's husband or wife for many years, but one doesn't really know them. That's what she said. I don't know my husband and my child. I only know them in terms of what I've always wanted of them. I don't really know what they're like. What is another human being when one really doesn't want anything of him or her? And then what is oneself? So when I'm not there and the other person isn't there, maybe then there can be love. The fullness, the wholeness of life. Here's what Andre says at one point in this conversation in the restaurant. Two men talking to each other in a restaurant while food is being served and eaten. Andre says, well, you see, I've seen a lot of death in these last few years. And there's one thing for sure about death. You do it alone. It seems really quite certain. You see that I've seen that people around your bed mean nothing. Your reviews mean nothing. Andre is a director and the other one is an actor, screenwriter. That's their business. Your reviews mean nothing. Whatever it is, you do it alone. And so the question is, when I get on my deathbed, what kind of person will I be? And I'm just very dubious about the kind of person who would have lived these last years the way I did. Wally says, why should you feel that way? Andre, well, you see, I've had a very rough time in the last few months, Wally. 3 different people in my family were in the hospital at the same time. Then my mother died. Then our daughter had something wrong with her back, and we were terribly worried about her, although she's going to be all right, thank God. I'm feeling very raw right now. I mean, I can't sleep, my nerves are shot. I feel like my face is being shoved in the mud, you know. I'm affected by everything. I mean, last week I had this really nice director from Norway over for dinner, and I've known him for years and years. And he's somebody that I think I'm very fond of. But I was just sitting there thinking that he was a pompous, defensive, conservative, stuffed shirt who was only interested in the theater. And he was talking and talking and talking. And you see, his mother was a famous Norwegian comedian. And I realized that he had said, I remember my mother at least 400 times during the evening. He was telling story after story about his mother. You know, I'd heard these stories 20 times before, and he was drinking a whole bottle of bourbon very quietly. And his laugh was so horrible, you see. I could hear his laugh, the pain in that laugh, the hollowness. what being that woman's son had done to him. So that at a certain point I had to just ask him to leave, nicely. I just told him I had to get up early the next morning because it was so horrible. It was just as if he had died in my living room. And then I went into the bathroom and cried because I had lost a friend. Actually, what he had lost was the image of a friend. The memory of a friend. And then after he had gone, I turned the television on and there was this guy who had just won the something or other, some sports event. And he had got a great big check in some kind of a huge silver bottle, and he couldn't stuff the check into the bottle somehow. And he put the bottle in front of his nose and pretended it was his face. And he wasn't really listening to the man who was interviewing him, but he was smiling malevolently at his friends. And I looked at him and thought, what a horrible, mean, empty, manipulative rat, And I thought, that guy is me. And then last night, it was actually our 20th wedding anniversary. I took Chiquita to see the show about Billie Holiday. And I just looked at these show business people who know nothing about Billie Holiday. Nothing, you see. They were really kind of, in a way, intellectual creeps. And suddenly I had this feeling, I was just sitting there crying through most of the show. And suddenly I had this feeling that I was just as creepy as they were. And that my whole life had been a sham, and that I didn't have the guts to be Billie Holiday either. I really feel I'm just washed up, wiped out. I've just squandered my life. Gosh, Andre, how can you say something like that? They eat long silence. Andre, but I may be in a very emotional state right now, but since I've come back home, I've just been finding the world we're living in more and more upsetting. He's been to all kinds of interesting workshops, actors' workshops in Poland. He's been to India and to Tibet and things like this, finding some very interesting experiences there. People here seem very strange to me. I really find the people here very strange. Wally, I agree with you, but I'm always trying to figure out how to describe just in what way they're strange. Why would you say they're strange? Well, all right. Well, last week I went down to the public theater one afternoon, and when I walked in, I said hello to everybody because I know them all, and they all know me, and they're always very friendly. And 7 or 8 people told me how wonderful I looked. Then one person said to me, a woman who runs the casting office said, "Gee, you look horrible. Is something wrong?" Now she, we started talking. Of course, I started telling her things, and then she burst into tears because an aunt of hers who is 80, whom she was very fond of, went into the hospital for a cataract, which was solved. But the nurse was so sloppy she didn't put the bed rails up, and the aunt fell out of bed, and now she's a cripple. So we're talking about hospitals. Now this woman, because this had happened to her very recently, she could see me with complete clarity. She didn't know anything about what I had been going through, but the other people, all they saw was this tan, or this shirt, and the fact that the shirt goes well with a tan. And so they said, "Gee, you look wonderful." Now, they're in an insane dream world. They're not looking. It's very strange to me. Wally, right, they didn't see anything somehow except the few little things that they wanted to see. Andre, it's like what happened just before my mother died. We'd gone to the hospital to see my mother, and I'd been in to see her, and I saw this woman that looked as bad as any survivor of Auschwitz or Dachau. And I was out in the hall sort of comforting my father, and this doctor, who was a specialist in the problem that she had with her arm, went into her room and came out just beaming, and he said to us, "Boy, don't we have a lot of reason to feel great. Isn't that wonderful how she's coming along?" Well, all he saw was the arm. That's all he saw. And here's another person who is existing in a dream. He comes out of that room and he psychically kills us by taking us into a dream world, you see, where we become confused and frightened, because the moment before we saw somebody who looked already dead, and now here he comes, the specialist, who tells us that everything is great. I mean, they were literally driving my father crazy, because here was an 82-year-old man who is very emotional, you know. And if you go in 1 minute and you see the person's dying and you don't want them to die, and then a doctor comes out 5 minutes later and tells you they're in wonderful shape, you know you can go crazy. Wally, right? I know what you mean. Andre, I mean the doctor didn't see my mother. The people at the public theater didn't see me. We're all walking around in some kind of fog. I think we're all in a trance. We're walking around like zombies. I mean, I don't think we're even aware of ourselves or of our own reactions to things. I mean, like with a Norwegian director, what would be the normal thing that we all would do now would be that I would have spent the evening with him, and then when Chiquita, his wife, came back, I would have said, "Oh, I had such a nice, cozy evening. Oh, we had such an interesting talk about Norway," and so on, even though actually I was absolutely miserable. And I found this man's company unbearable. You know, if you admit to yourself that you just spent an evening with someone and for some reason or another, on that particular evening, they were somehow driving you insane, then I think you immediately begin to feel some kind of sympathy for that person. You begin to wonder how he came to be in the state he's in. But we don't admit those things to ourselves. We just bottle everything up. I mean, really, we're just going around all day like unconscious machines. And meanwhile, there's all this rage and worry and uneasiness just building up and building up inside of us. And Wally says, yes, it's right, they build up. And then they leap out inappropriately. I mean, I remember when I was in a play, and I was playing the part of the cat, but they had trouble making up my cat suit. So in fact, I didn't get it all delivered to me until the night of the first performance. Particularly the head, I'd never even had a chance to try it on. And about 4 of my fellow actors actually came up to me and said things which I just couldn't help thinking were attempts to destroy me. You know, one of them said, "Oh, that head will totally change your hearing in the performance. You'll hear everything completely differently, and it may be very upsetting." Why, I was once in a performance where I was wearing earmuffs and I couldn't hear anything anybody said. And then another actor said, "Oh, you know, whenever I wear even a hat on stage, I tend to faint." I mean, those remarks were just full of hostility, because, you know, if I'd listened to those people, I would have gone out there on stage and I wouldn't have even been able to hear anything, and I would have fainted. But, you know, the hostility was completely inappropriate because, in fact, those people liked me. I mean, the hostility was some feeling left over from some previous experience. Because somehow in our social existence we're only allowed to express our feelings weirdly and indirectly. If you express them directly, everyone goes crazy. Andre, did you express your feelings about what those people said to you? Wally, no. I mean, I didn't really even know what I felt until I thought about it later. Now Andre says at a later point, "Well, look, I remember a night, was about 2 weeks after my mother died, and I was in a pretty bad shape, and I went out to dinner with 3 relatively close friends, 2 of whom had known my mother quite well, and all 3 of whom have known me for years. And we went through that entire evening without my being able to for a moment get anywhere near what, you know, not what I wanted to sit and have a dreary evening, in which I was talking about all this pain that I was going through and everything, really not at all, but the fact that nobody could say, 'Gee, what a shame about your mother, how are you feeling?' But it was as if nothing had happened, and everyone was just making these jokes and laughing. Later Andre says, but these are typical evenings for us. We go to parties or dinners like that all the time. And these evenings are really sort of sickly dreams, because people are talking in symbols. Everyone is sort of floating through this fog of symbols and unconscious feelings. No one says what they're really thinking about. They don't talk to each other. They don't talk to each other, because I think people are really in some sort of state of fear or panic about the world we're living in. But they don't know it, and so you just hear these odd lines of dialogue that seem to come from nowhere. You know, someone will be attacking some movie they saw or some article they read. Someone else will be talking about crime in New York or the subways or something. Someone else will be shouting about what a terrible time they're having at the party itself. And then people will start making these jokes that are really some sort of secret code. Wally, right. Well, what often happens in some of these evenings is that people will start spinning these really crazy little fantasies, and everybody will be talking at once. I mean, it's really amazing. It's unbelievable. I mean, that's the only way anything is expressed, through these completely insane jokes. That may be why I never understand what's going on at the party, and I'm always completely confused. Andre said, I think that's right. What we need is to analyze our situation in the world with great clarity, so that we can act and respond appropriately. But instead, when we get together, we fall into kind of a collective hysteria in which nobody knows what's going on. And I mean, it may be, Wally, that one of the reasons that we don't know what's going on is that when we're there at once at these parties, we're all too busy performing. We're concentrating on playing our own roles and giving a good performance. So we can't perceive what's really going on around us, or one may add what's going on inside of us. That was one of the reasons Grotowski, that's this actor who gives these workshops in Poland where people do all kind of things, spontaneously, so to speak, it is called spontaneous. That was one of the reasons Grotowski gave up the theater, you know. He just felt that people in their lives now were performing so well that performance in the theater was sort of superfluous and in a way obscene. I mean, isn't it amazing how often a doctor will live up to our expectation of how a doctor should look? And when you see a terrorist on television, he looks just like a terrorist. I mean, we live in a world in which fathers or single people or artists are all trying to live up to someone's fantasy of how a father or a single person or an artist should look and behave. And so everyone acts as if they know exactly how they ought to conduct themselves at every single moment. And they all seem to be totally self-confident. Of course, privately, people are very mixed up about themselves, you know, and don't know what they should be doing in their lives. And they're reading all these self-help books. Wally, right. And I mean, these books are so touching, because they show how desperately curious we are to know how all the others of us are really getting on in life. Even though by performing these roles all the time, we're hiding the reality of ourselves from everyone else, including ourselves. You know, we do live in ludicrous ignorance of each other. I mean, we usually don't know the things we'd like to know, even about our supposedly closest friends. I mean, suppose you're going through some kind of hell in your own life. Well, you would love to know if your friends have experienced similar things, but we really don't dare to ask each other. Andre, no, it would be like asking your friend to drop his role. Wally, we just put no value at all on perceiving reality. On the contrary, the incredible emphasis we place now on our so-called careers automatically makes perceiving reality a very low priority. Because if your life is organized around trying to be successful in a career, then it just doesn't matter what you perceive or what you experience. You're just thinking. Certainly, as an aside, a career does not need to be in business or government life. It can be a career in spiritual life. Well, have I done the thing that I've planned? Have I performed this necessary action for my career or my progress? And so you really can sort of shut your mind off for years ahead in that way. You can sort of turn on the automatic pilot. Just the way your mother's doctors had on his automatic pilot when he went in and looked at the arm and totally failed to perceive anything else. Andre Wright. Our minds are just focused on these goals and plans, which in themselves are not reality. Wally, no, goals and plans are not reality, they're fantasy. They're part of a dream life. And you know, it always does seem so ridiculous somehow that everybody has to have his little goal in life. It's so absurd in a way. I mean, when you consider that it doesn't matter which one it is. I mean, I guess maybe it's satisfying to devote your life to trying to get money or trying to create great works of art. I don't know. But when they're so interchangeable, somehow it seems sort of pathetic. Andre, yeah, it does. Another goal is to become a spiritually developed person. Become a liberated, to become an enlightened person. And all these subtle roles one may pick up with that. And one may see others performing around one. But there it's especially hard to look because this is what is called religiously sanctioned. This is more taboo than anything else, to look, to touch, to open up. Wally said somehow it seems sort of pathetic. Andre says, yeah, it does. Wally, but we just seem to think today that the person who pursues his goals most single-mindedly and fanatically is the person most worthy of respect. Later on, Andre says, and then because people's concentration is on their goals, in their life they just live each moment by habit, really. Just like the Norwegian telling the same story over and over. Life becomes habitual. And it is today. You're just operating by habit. Then you're not really living. I mean, you know, in Sanskrit, the root of the verb to be is the same as to grow or to make grow. Then at a later place, Andre says, you see, you have to learn now. It didn't used to be necessary, but today you have to learn something like, are you really hungry? Or are you just stuffing your face because that's what you do out of habit? I mean, you can afford to do it, so you do it, whether you're hungry or not. Now, if you go to the Buddhist meditation center, they make you taste each bite of your food so that it takes about 2 hours. It's horrible to eat your lunch. But you're conscious of the taste of the food. If you're just eating out of habit, you don't taste the food, and you're not in touch with the reality of what's happening to you. You're in a dream world again. Actually, it was interesting to see at the moment this was being said, the two of them were really eating very unconsciously. And at no point did one of the two say, "What are we really eating? Let's taste it." And I was in a fancy restaurant. The food was very elaborately fixed, and that was really behaving like people behave in an expensive restaurant, ignoring the waiter almost, who sort of looked curiously at them. They seemed to be different. So there's a world of difference between talking about something and actually doing it. Not just what one did in the past and may have done in the past with awareness, but now, right now, this instant, where are we? And it takes a very still listening. Not what to listen to, but just listening. Later on, Wally says, you know, when you talk about our attitudes toward people, I mean, you know, I think of myself as a very decent, good person, simply because I think I'm reasonably friendly to most of the people I happen to meet every day. I mean, I really think of myself quite smugly, and I think I'm perfectly nice guy, so long as I somehow think of the world as consisting of, you know, just a small circle of the people I know as my friends. Or just a few people that we know in this little world of our hobbies, the theater or whatever it is. And I'm really quite self-satisfied. I'm happy with myself. I have no complaint about myself. But the thing is, you know, let's face it, there's a whole enormous world out there that I don't even think about. And I certainly don't take responsibility for I've lived in that world. I mean, if I were actually to confront the fact that I'm sort of sharing the stage with a starving person in Africa somewhere, well, then I wouldn't feel so great about myself. So naturally I blot these people out of my perception. So of course I'm ignoring a whole section of the real world. You know, Hannah Arendt was always writing about the fact that the more involved you are in corruption or evil, the more you are involved in corruption or evil, and the more areas of your own existence there are that you therefore don't want to think about, or that you can't face, or that you have to lie about, the more distorted your perception of reality will be in general. One thing is operating. What one doesn't face in oneself automatically is projected onto someone else. And there one can face it. critically or enviously. But we're not different from each other. And it works the other way around. If the most, quote, horrible, unquote, thing can be faced in oneself, then not needing to project it onto someone else, then these barriers fall away that separate us from each other. And of course, if we feel bad about ourselves and therefore ignore, bottle up, obviously the perception will be distorted. Because all the emotions that this guilt and bottling up, repression triggers throughout the organism affects perception, affects the hearing, the seeing, everything. Wally says, in other words, we all have every reason to hide from reality, and it's a terrible problem. I think if we have every reason not to hide from reality, and then it won't be a problem. But what is reality for someone who lives in a dream? Because the dream is taken for reality. And yet if there is this real concern with who one actually is, what the truth is, what reality is, there are these moments of coming to. The dream interrupts for a moment of awareness. But rather than a genuine wonder at this moment of awareness, or joy, we feel bad about what we did. And the awareness is gone. It's a new dream. Can one see that happening? Not to me, but to a human being. Because we share these happenings, they're common to all of us. In another place, Wally says, but I mean the main thing, Andre, is why do we require a trip to Mount Everest in order to be able to perceive one moment of reality? Is Mount Everest more real than New York? Isn't New York real? What's New York right now? He goes on, I think if you could become fully aware of what existed in the cigar store next door to this restaurant, why not right at this table? In the cigar store next to this restaurant, it would blow your brains out. I mean, isn't there just as much reality to be perceived in a cigar store as there's on Mount Everest? They're different realities. But the point is well taken. Except it is taken in thought. One can perceive this more. If one can't perceive this instant what's there, then you can't perceive what's in the cigar store. Or on Mount Everest. Because perception is never in the future or in one's fantasy, but right now. And that too can become a concept. What do you think, he says, about that there's just as much reality to be perceived in a cigar store as there is on Mount Everest? What do you think? I mean, I think that not only is there nothing more real about Mount Everest, I think there's nothing different in a certain way. I mean, reality is sort of uniform in a way, because it's, at this point, total speculation what reality is. And yet, maybe just talking about it is very important, because there's a serious concern in these two people. One doesn't have the feel that they're just acting out roles. So that if your perceptions are, if your own mechanism is operating correctly, says Wally, it would become irrelevant to go to Mount Everest, and sort of absurd, because, well, just, I mean, of course, I mean, on some level, obviously, it's very different from a cigar store on 7th Avenue. But, I mean, Andre says, well, I agree with you, Wally, but the problem is that people can't see the cigar store now. It's also so typical of our way of talking. People can't see it. It's so much easier to talk about the people than to talk about oneself, or to look at that moment one can't even talk. Or can one talk while looking? Maybe if the seeing is there, the words will come. But those are different words from speculative ones about reality, about other people seeing or not seeing. Andre had just said the problem is people can't see the cigar store now. Wally, well, why do you think that is? Why is that? Is it just because people are lazy today, or they're bored? You know, when children are poor and they live in the country and have just a few little things to play with, then they're very, very thrilled by those few little things. But if they're rich and live in the city and have 1,000 things to play with, then they always seem to be bored, and it's impossible to find anything to interest them. Andre says, well, the word spoiled isn't a chance word, it's a strong word. Yeah. To be spoiled. Right, in other words, they're lost in that sense. I mean, spoiled means, a piece of meat that's been spoiled can't be unspoiled. It's doomed. Andre, right. Wally, so is that our problem? Is that what you're saying? Are we just like bored, spoiled children who've been lying in the bathtub all day playing with their plastic duck, and now they're thinking, what can I do? Andre, okay, yes, we're bored now. We're all bored. But has it ever occurred to you, Wally, that the process which creates this boredom that we see in the world now may very well be a self-perpetuating unconscious form of brainwashing created by a world totalitarian government based on money. Yeah, here he's got it. We do that, or don't we? It's very hard to sit with boredom and not escape into such fulfilling speculations. Even though what he says may have something to it, it is an operating influence, obviously. But just to sit with boredom and not get the entertainment of speculation out of it, of what causes this boredom, but let it reveal itself by sitting with it. With no separation of I don't like it, I want it to blow away. Or what can I do to get rid of it, which are not often very conscious, verbalized attitudes. It's very subtle. Separation can be a hairbreadth of. But it's not being with it, not being open to this. Not even calling it boredom, because that word already does something. Andre goes on there, and that all of this is much more dangerous really than one thinks. And that it's not just a question of individual survival, Wally, but that somebody who's bored is asleep. And somebody who's asleep will not say no. It's a very, very valid observation. As regarding a totalitarian regime, it's much simpler to go along, to follow, to obey. Then one doesn't have to wake up and think for oneself and take the risk of criticism or ostracism. When one is asleep or following, obeying, then it's no problem to stay asleep. He talks about meeting somebody, a Swedish physicist. Oh no, this is already having dinner with someone else. I had dinner with 2 European friends of mine the other night, and they used to love New York. And they said everybody had turned into robots here, everybody. The food was robot food, and you said something to people and you really didn't get a response. They said New York had become like a morgue. When I was at Findhorn, I met this extraordinary English tree expert who had devoted his life to saving trees, and he just got back from Washington lobbying to save the redwoods. And he was 84 years old. He always travels with a backpack because he never knows where he's going to be tomorrow. And when I met him at Findhorn, he said to me, "Where are you from?" And I said, "New York." And he said, "Ah, New York. Yes, that's a very interesting place. Do you know a lot of New Yorkers who keep talking about the fact that they want to leave but never do?" And I said, "Oh, yes." And he said, "Why do you think they don't leave?" And I gave him different banal theories. And he said, "Oh, I don't think it's that way at all." He said, "I think that New York is the new model for the new concentration camp, where the camp has been built by the inmates themselves, And the inmates are the guards, and they have this pride in this thing that they've built. They've built their own prison, and so they exist in a state of schizophrenia where they're both guards and prisoners. And as a result, they no longer have the capacity to leave the prison they've made, or even to see that it is a prison. And then he went into his pocket and he took out a seed for a tree, and he said, "This is a pine tree." He put it in my hand and said, "Escape before it's too late." Where are you going to escape to? Because there's a more immediate prison than New York. Which we constantly build and guard and rarely see. And if we see it and the walls break down, then often there's a scaredness. Like I've heard prisoners say when they leave prison, it's scary to be, quote, free, unquote. Sometimes you just commit a crime to be readmitted to where there is this assumed safety being taken care of, not having to take responsibility. Andre says, "You know, Wally, for 2 or 3 years, Chiquita and I have actually had this very unpleasant feeling that we really should get out. We really feel like Jews in Germany in the late 30s, get out of here. Of course, the problem is where to go, because it seems quite obvious that the whole world is going in the same direction. There will simply be all these robots walking around feeling nothing and thinking nothing." And later he says, "You see, I keep thinking that we need a new language, a language of the heart. A language as in the Polish forest where language wasn't needed. It was a workshop that took place where all kind of weird things happened, and then people felt very free and spontaneous and loving and close to each other without words. Some kind of language between people that is a new kind of poetry, that is the poetry of the dancing bee that tells us where the honey is. And I think that in order to create that language, we're going to have to learn how you can go through a looking glass into another kind of perception, in which you have that sense of being united to all things, and suddenly you understand everything. It says here, Wally says nothing. Waiter comes to the table. Wally and Andre order coffee. And Andre goes on, "I mean, Wally, you see, there's this incredible..." Oh, I don't want to go into this one. He's very taken with magical things. You can read this yourself. Yeah, Andre talks about some building there in Findhorn and trying to take off for other outer space and keeping the roof down so it can either be a roof or open up for maybe somebody from outer space. I don't even remember it. Wally says, "Well, Andre, I mean, my actual response, I mean, Andre, really, I'm just trying to survive, you know. I mean, I'm trying to earn a living." At this point, Wally has had it. "I'm trying to pay my rent and my bills. I mean, I live my life. I enjoy staying home with Debbie. I'm reading Charlton Heston's autobiography and that." And that's that. Pause. "I mean, occasionally, maybe, Debbie and I will step outside and we'll go to a party or something. And if I can occasionally get my little talent together and write a play, well, then that's wonderful. And I enjoy reading about other little plays that people have written, and reading the reviews of those plays and what people said about them and what people said about what people said. And I mean, I have a list of errands and responsibilities that I keep in a notebook, and I enjoy going through my list and carrying out the responsibilities and doing the errands and then crossing them off my list. And I mean, I just don't know how anybody could enjoy anything more than I enjoy reading Charlton Heston's autobiography. And, you know, getting up in the morning and having the cup of cold coffee that's been waiting for me all night, still there, for me to drink in the morning. And no cockroach or fly has died in it overnight. I'm just so thrilled when I get up and I see that coffee there, just the way I want it. I just can't imagine enjoying something else any more than that. I mean, obviously, if there is a dead cockroach in it, then I just have a feeling of disappointment, and I'm sad. But I mean, I don't think I feel the need for anything more than all this. One knows this response, doesn't one? Seems to come close to something which isn't really anything anymore. Or facing boredom, facing the prison, and then retracting back into it and trying to represent it to oneself as what's wrong with this? This is okay. Whereas you seem to be saying that it's inconceivable that anybody could be having a meaningful life today, and everyone is totally destroyed, and we need to live in these outposts. But I mean, even for you, I just can't believe, I mean, don't you find, isn't it pleasant just to get up in the morning and there's Chiquita, there are the children, the Times is delivered. You can read it and maybe you'll direct a play. Maybe you won't direct a play, but forget about the play that you may or may not direct. Why is it necessary why not lean back and just enjoy these details? I mean, and there would be a delicious cup of coffee and a piece of coffee cake. I mean, why is it necessary to have more than this? Or even think about having more than this? I mean, I really don't know what you're talking about. I mean, I know what you're talking about, but I don't really know what you're talking about. And now he just goes on going into the particular things that Andre said, which is not the point. Still sort of misses the point. At another place, Wally says, you know, the truth is, I think I do know what really disturbs me about the work that you've described. If I've understood what you've been saying, it somehow seems that the whole point of the work that you did in those workshops, when you get right down to it and ask what it really was all about, the whole point really, I think, was to enable the people in the workshops, including yourself, to somehow sort or strip away every scrap of purposefulness from certain selected moments. And the point of it was so that you would then be able to experience somehow just pure being. In other words, you were trying to discover what it would be like to live for certain moments without having any particular thing that you were supposed to be doing. I mean, that was the purpose of these workshops, really, and I think I just simply object to that. I mean, I just don't think I accept the idea that there should be moments in which you're not trying to do anything. I think it's our nature to do things. I think we should do things. I think purposefulness is part of our ineradicable, basic human structure. Groping always for something that is ineradicable, so one can hold on to it and doesn't have to look. Do you see what I'm saying, he says? I mean, if I'm sitting at home and I have nothing to do, well, naturally I reach for a book. I mean, what would be so great about just sitting there and doing nothing? It seems absurd. Andre says, and if Debbie is there? Wally, well, that's the same thing. I mean, is there really such a thing as two people doing nothing but just simply being together? Would they simply then be relating, to use the word we're always using? What would that mean? I mean, either we're going to have a conversation, or we're going to carry out the garbage, or we're going to do something, separately or together. Do you see what I'm saying? I mean, what does it mean to just simply sit there? Andre, that makes you nervous. Wally, why shouldn't it make me nervous? It just seems ridiculous to me. Andre, yeah, huh? Well, that's interesting, Wally, because when I went to Ladakh, I guess it's in Tibet, yeah, that's on the border of China and Tibet, and stayed on a farm for a month. Well, there, when the people came over in the evening for tea, nobody says anything. Unless there's something to say, but there almost never is. So they just sit there and they drink their tea, and it doesn't seem to bother them. Wally says, yeah, pause. And Andre says, you see, Wally, the trouble with always being active and doing things is that it's quite possible to do all sorts of things and at the same time be completely dead inside. I mean, you're doing all these things, but are you doing them because you really feel an impulse to do them? Or are you doing them mechanically, as we were saying before? Because I do believe that if you're just living mechanically, then you have to change your life. I mean, when you're young, you go out on dates all the time, you go dance or something, you're floating free, and then one day you find yourself in a relationship, and suddenly everything freezes. And this can be true in your work as well. And I mean, as long as you're really alive inside, then of course there's no problem. I mean, if you're living with someone in one little room and there's a life going on between you and the person you're living with, well then a whole adventure can be going on right in that room. But there's always that danger that things can go dead. It's a very frightening thing to have to realize suddenly that, my God, I thought I was living my life, but in fact I haven't been a human being. I've been a performer. I haven't been living. I've been acting. I've acted the role of the father. I've acted the role of the husband. I've acted the role of the friend. I've acted the role of the writer or director or whatever. I've lived in the same room with this person, but I haven't really seen them, haven't really heard them, haven't really been with them. Wally says, I know what you mean. Sometimes people are just existing side by side. I mean, the other person's face could just turn into a great wolf's face for seconds, and it wouldn't be noticed. Andre says it wouldn't be noticed. No, wouldn't be noticed. I mean, Wally, when I was in Israel a little When I was in Israel a little while ago, I mean, I have this picture of Chiquita that I always carry with me. And it was taken when she was about 26 or something. And it's in summer, and she's stretched out on a terrace in this sort of old-fashioned long skirt that's kind of pulled up. And she's slim and sensual and beautiful. And I've always looked at that picture, and I've always thought about how just how sexy she looks. And this year in Israel, I looked at the picture, and I realized that the face in the picture was the saddest face in the world. That girl at that time was lost, just so sad and so alone. I've been carrying this picture for years and not ever really seen what it is, I just had never looked at that picture. And you see, at a certain point, I just simply realized I'd gone for good 18 years unable to feel, except in the most extreme situations. And I realized that, in fact, every day of one's life is made up of 1,000 constantly shifting feelings. I mean, I always knew this in the theater. That was precisely my conception of what a play was. But I didn't know it in my life. And I didn't really accept the fact that I'm a creature who wants to die of love for my daughter one moment, and the next moment I want to lock her in the cookie jar. I mean, to some extent, I still had the ability to live in my work. That was why I was such a work junkie. That was why I felt that every play I did was a matter of life and death. But in my real life, I was dead. I was a robot. I mean, my life with Chiquita has always been the most important thing in the world to me. But then it was frozen because I was afraid that if I allowed myself to feel anything, I'd destroy everything. I mean, Wally, at that time I didn't even allow myself to feel angry or annoyed. And you see, if you can't react to another person, then there's no possibility of action or interaction. And if there isn't, then I don't really know what the word love means, except duty, obligation, sentimentality, fear, pause. I mean, I don't know about you, Wally, but I just had to put myself into kind of a training program to learn how to be a human being. I mean, what did I feel about anything? I didn't know. The only way I could think to find out was just to cut out all the noise around me and stop performing for a few moments and just listen to what was inside me. I think there comes a time when you need to do that. Now maybe in order to do it you have to go to the Sahara. Maybe you can do it at home. But you need to cut out the noise. How do you cut out that noise? Wally says, yeah, of course, personally, I don't usually like those quiet moments, I really don't. I mean, I don't know if it is that Freudian thing or what. I mean, the fear of unconscious impulses or my own aggression, or, I mean, if things get too quiet, and as we were saying, I find myself just sitting there, whether I'm by myself or I'm with somebody else, well, I just have this feeling of, my God, I'm going to be revealed. I mean, I'm adequate. I mean, I'm adequate to do any sort of task, but I'm not adequate just to be a human being. I mean, I'm not, if I'm just trapped there and I'm not allowed to do things, but all I can do is just be there, I will fail. In other words, I can pass any other test and get an A if I put in the required effort. I don't have a clue how to pass this test. Of course, it isn't really a test, but I see it as a test, and I feel I'm going to fail it. I mean, it's really scary. I just feel totally at sea. I mean, another point Andre says, after all, there are some pretty good reasons for being frightened. Because first of all, a human being is a dangerous and complex creature. I mean, really, if you start living each moment Christ, that's quite a challenge. I mean, if you really reach out and you're really in touch with the other person, well, that's really something to strive for. I think I really do. The striving for something already becomes a goal again. And if the goal becomes important, one doesn't see the other person and oneself. One is now infused with energy to reach the goal of reaching out. This person who talked during the retreat said, actually, at that moment of not being there and no one being there, the thought came up, is there relationship? And the word relationship seemed totally inappropriate, irrelevant, unnecessary. Because you don't have to give a reason. You can see it for yourself. Relationship is always limited. Or is it? Andre just talked about this reaching out, the striving for reaching out to touch someone, and Wally says it's just so pathetic if one doesn't do that. Andre, absolutely, it's just nothing. I mean, at least attempt it. Even if you can't make it, attempt it. Even if you're going blind, do some kind of exercises for your eyes, or something. Always still doing something. Or can one just really at one instant not know what to do? Honest to goodness, not know what to do. And yet not then do despair. Not knowing. And the energy gathered in not knowing what to do. And leaving everything as it is. Without this constant doer. Andre goes on, but of course there's a problem. The closer you come, I think, to another human being, the more really completely mysterious that person becomes, and the more unreachable. Don't really know from where he's talking. Unreachable by image? Then, or what? He says, the closer you come to another human being, the more really completely mysterious that person becomes. If you don't know her or him, which you can't and don't, it's a fact. All you know is memories. This instant of being together is not yet recorded. It's new. But we don't leave it that way. We make it into the old. You know, you have to reach out to that person, you have to go back and forth with them, you have to relate, and yet you're relating to a ghost or something, I don't know, because we're ghosts, we're phantoms. Who are we? We're so used to knowing what somebody is in terms of our memory. If that in any way is disturbed, then one gets all upset. But to ask, who are we? And not look for an answer, an explanation, or more words. To just let that question work on its own. And attend, open, listen. Without knowing. Who are we? Wally says, right, Andre, and that's to confront the fact that you're completely alone. To accept that you're alone is to accept death. Wally, you mean because somehow when you are alone, you're alone with death? Nothing's obstructing your view of it, or something like that. Right. Andre, you know, in the sexual act there's that moment of complete forgetting which is so incredible. And in the next moment you start to think about things, work on the play, what you've got to do tomorrow. I don't know if this is true of you, but I think it must be quite common. The world comes in quite fast. Now that may be because we don't have the courage to stay in that place. He says here, in this place of forgetting, but forget about forgetting. Just not to know. Not knowing means being with whatever is, without knowing. Because that is again close to death. Like people who are afraid to go to sleep, in other words, you interrelate and you don't know what the next moment will bring. And you don't know what the next moment will bring. No, he says, and to not know what the next moment will bring, I think, brings you closer to a perception of death. So that paradoxically, the closer you get to living, in the sense of relating constantly, I guess the closer you get to this thing that we're most afraid of. Yeah. And Andre says, you see, I think that's why people have affairs. I mean, you know, in the theater, if you get good reviews, you feel for a moment that you've got your hands on something. You know what I mean? It's a good feeling, but then that feeling goes very quickly. And once again, you don't quite know what will happen next and what you should do. Well, have an affair and go, and up to a certain point, you really feel you're on firm ground. There's a sexual conquest to be made. There are different questions. Does she enjoy the ears being nibbled? How intensely can you talk about Schopenhauer at an elegant French restaurant? Or whatever nonsense it is. It's all, I think, to give you the semblance that there's a firm earth. But have a real relationship with a person that goes on for years, well, that's completely unpredictable. Then you've cut off all your ties to the land, and you're sailing into the unknown, into uncharted seas. And I mean, people hang on to these images of father, mother, husband, wife, again for the same reasons, because they seem to provide some firm ground. But there's no wife there. What does that mean? A wife, a husband, a son. A baby holds your hands, and then suddenly there's this huge man lifting you off the ground, and then he's gone. Where is that son, you know? Yeah. It's the end of a conversation, just Wally narrating. I rode home through the city streets. There wasn't a street, there wasn't a building that wasn't connected to some memory in my mind. There I was buying a suit with my father. There I was having an ice cream soda after school. When I finally came in, Debbie was home from work, and I told her everything about my dinner with Andre. And then was that the end of it all? We'll end here for today.